Welcome to Vesper Shroud, the place where the ordinary world slips away and the strange edges of reality creep closer. Tonight, we walk into Alaska, a land carved by silence, ice, and stories no one wants to believe. They say the wilderness there isn't empty, it's alive. Hunters claim something stalks them back. Drivers talk of figures standing in the road that vanish before headlights. And entire villages whisper about spirits that follow the wind. These are real tales, gathered from true events, local myths, and encounters that cling like frost to memory. If you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the darkness doesn't end when the video does. Now lean closer. The stories are waiting, and Alaska never forgives those who listen lightly. Story 1. Unopened mailbox at Whittier. I found the warning letter in a dead man's mailbox, and it was dated 3 weeks after he was buried. My name is Robert, and I am a postal inspector for the state of Alaska. I have worked for the Postal Service for 23 years, and I have delivered mail to every remote location this state has to offer. I have driven across frozen tundra. I have boated through ice-choked passages. I have hiked into wilderness areas where civilization feels like a distant memory. I am accustomed to isolation. I am accustomed to strange circumstances. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened at Whittier, Alaska, or for the terrifying realization that some places are not supposed to be visited, some communities are not meant to be inhabited, and some mailboxes should never be opened. Whittier is one of the most unusual places in America. It is a town of 214 people, and almost all of them live in a single building. This is not an exaggeration. Whittier is essentially a small city contained within one massive structure called the Baggage Towers. The building stands 14 stories tall. It contains apartments, a school, a church, a general store, a post office, a laundromat, and even a jail. The entire functioning community of Whittier exists within the walls of this one building. People are born there. People live their entire lives there. People die there. Some people have never left the building in decades. To get to Whittier, you have to take a single-lane tunnel through a mountain. The tunnel is called the Whittier Tunnel, and it is the only road access to the town. During the day, vehicles travel one direction. During the night, vehicles travel the opposite direction. If you miss the day tunnel opening or the night tunnel opening, you are stuck for 12 hours. I was sent to Whittier in late September to investigate a peculiar postal situation. A man named George Hendricks had died on August 28th. He was 73 years old, and he had lived in the Baggage Towers for most of his adult life. He had no family in the building. He had no close friends that anyone could identify. The tower residents had reported his death to the authorities, and George Hendricks had been cremated. His apartment had been emptied. His belongings had been distributed or discarded. His mailbox had been locked and marked as belonging to a deceased resident. On September 15th, almost 3 weeks after George's death, George's mailbox received a piece of mail. This was not unusual in itself. Mail sometimes arrives after a person has died, and it typically gets marked as undeliverable. But when the postal clerk at the Whittier post office attempted to process the letter, something deeply unsettling occurred. The letter had no return address. It had no postmark. It had no indication of how it had arrived in George Hendricks' mailbox. The letter was handwritten on a piece of ordinary white paper, and the message on that paper was the reason I was being sent to Whittier to investigate. The message said, simply, "Do not open it." The postal clerk, a woman named Margaret, had kept the letter. She had not opened George's mailbox. She had locked the letter inside and had reported the incident to the postal inspector office in Anchorage. This is why I was on a flight to Anchorage, and why I was now driving through that single-lane tunnel toward a town that felt increasingly like a place that did not want visitors. I arrived at Whittier on a gray October afternoon. The Baggage Towers loomed above me like something organic and alive, a monument to isolation and confinement that seemed to pulse with a strange, unsettling energy. The building was massive and gray and utterly monolithic. There were no streets around it, no town spreading outward. Just the building, standing alone, with the ocean on one side and mountains on the other. The sky was overcast. The air smelled like salt and cold and something else I could not quite identify. Something metallic, something that made my teeth ache. I parked my truck and entered the building. The interior of the Baggage Towers was exactly as strange as I had been warned it would be. The moment I stepped through the front door, I was inside a complete, self-contained world. There were hallways branching in multiple directions, There were storefronts and apartments. There was even what appeared to be an internal street lined with weathered facades of old buildings that predated the tower itself. The building seemed to contain the remnants of Whittier's entire history, compressed and stacked and sealed away from the outside world. Margaret was waiting for me at the post office. She was a woman in her mid-50s with the particular exhaustion of someone who has lived in a confined space for too long. She handed me the unopened letter with visibly trembling hands. The letter was addressed to George Hendricks in simple block letters. The handwriting was shaky, as if it had been written by someone very old or very afraid. The message inside was still the same: do not open it. I asked Margaret if she had any theories about who might have sent this letter. She told me something that made my skin go cold. She said that 3 residents of the Begich Towers had reported receiving similar letters over the past 5 years. All of the letters were addressed to people who had recently died. All of the letters contained the same warning. All of the letters had arrived in mailboxes that no one could explain. And all of the people who had received these letters, the people who had found them in the mailboxes of deceased residents, had experienced psychological breaks within weeks of finding the correspondence. One woman had become convinced that the building was moving, that it was shifting and changing, that the layout of the hallways was subtly different every time she walked them. She had eventually barricaded herself in her apartment and had to be removed by the state police. Another man had started screaming that he could hear people whispering inside the walls. He had been taken to a psychiatric facility in Anchorage and had never returned to Whittier. The third person had disappeared. She had walked out of the building one day and had never come back. Her body was never found. The assumption was that she had gotten lost in the surrounding wilderness and had either been killed by animals or had frozen to death. I told Margaret that I needed to investigate further. I asked to see the mailbox. She took me to the post office area, which was small and cramped and seemed to contain far more mail than it should. She showed me the unopened mailbox belonging to George Hendricks. It was a small metal box, identical to dozens of others in the room. But as I looked at it, I felt something shift in my chest. I felt a kind of dread that I could not immediately explain. I asked Margaret when exactly the letter had arrived. She said she did not know. It had simply appeared in the mailbox one morning. No one had seen it being placed there. No one had heard anything unusual. It had simply materialized, as if it had fallen from the air itself. I decided to open the mailbox. Against my better judgment, against the explicit warning written on the mysterious letter, I asked Margaret for the key, and I opened George Hendricks' mailbox. The mailbox contained only 2 items, the handwritten warning letter and a second envelope with no markings at all. My hands were shaking as I reached into the mailbox to retrieve the second envelope. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt it. That sensation of being watched. That terrifying awareness that something had shifted in the atmosphere, that I had crossed a line, that I had done something that could not be undone. The second envelope was sealed. I opened it, and inside was a single piece of paper. On that paper was a list of names, 15 names, written in the same shaky handwriting as the warning letter. At the top of the list was the name George Hendricks. The next 14 names were residents of the Begich Towers. I recognized some of the names. They were people who had lived in the building for many years. They were people who had never left, who had made the tower their entire world, who had allowed themselves to become completely consumed by this one structure. Below the list of names was a message. It said, "They are coming. They have always been coming. They live in the spaces between the walls. They live in the tunnel. They live in the darkness below the building. They are here because we invited them. And now they are hungry." I felt my hands trembling as I held the paper. I have tried, over the months since that day, to convince myself that this was some kind of hoax or prank. I have tried to tell myself that someone in the building had written this letter to cause fear or disturbance. But I know that is not true. I know that something is fundamentally wrong with Whittier. I can feel it every time I think about that building. I can feel it in the way the air seemed to press against me, in the way the walls seemed to absorb sound, in the way the residents moved through the corridors with the glazed expressions of people who were being controlled by something other than their own consciousness. I made a decision that I now recognize as a terrible mistake. I decided to stay in Whittier for several days to investigate further. I rented a small apartment in the Begich Towers. I took meals in the common dining area. I walked through the hallways, and I began to understand that Margaret had been telling me the truth. The building was wrong. The layout did not make sense. Hallways seemed to loop back on themselves. Stairwells led to places they should not lead. I found myself walking down corridors that seemed familiar and suddenly realizing that I was somewhere I had never been before. The geography of the building was not fixed. It was changing, or, more accurately, my perception of it was changing, which amounted to the same thing. On my second night in the building, I heard the whispering. It came from the walls. It started as a faint sound, barely audible, but it gradually grew louder. The whispers were speaking in a language I did not recognize. The sound was hollow and distant, as if the voices were coming from very far away. I left my apartment and walked into the hallway. Other residents were emerging from their apartments as well. We stood in the corridor, listening to the sound, and I saw in their faces that this was normal for them. This was a regular occurrence. This was something they had learned to accept as simply part of living in the baggage towers. I went back to the post office the next morning and told Margaret that I needed to see the other mysterious letters. She took me to a locked room in the postal office where she had stored them. There were 4 letters in total, each one addressed to a different deceased resident. Each one containing the same warning, do not open it, but only George Hendricks' mailbox had contained the secondary envelope with the list of names. Margaret said that she did not know why George's mailbox was special. She said that George had lived in the tower for 47 years. He had never left. He had rarely left his apartment. In fact, he had been one of the oldest residents and one of the most isolated. I asked Margaret if she believed that the building was haunted. She told me something that I have thought about every single day since. She said that hauntings implied that spirits or ghosts were trapped in a location. But she did not believe that was what was happening in Whittier. She believed that something was being housed in the building, something that needed to be kept confined. She believed that the tunnel, the isolation, the single structure containing the entire community, all of it was intentional. She believed that Whittier had been designed to keep something contained. And she believed that the lists of names, the mysterious letters, the whispering in the walls, these were all signs that whatever was contained in the building was beginning to escape. I left Whittier the next day. I drove through the tunnel back to civilization, and I have never returned. But the terrifying part is that I have not been able to leave Whittier completely. The building has followed me. Every night, I hear the whispering. Every day, I find myself thinking about those residents, about Margaret, about the names on that list, about what might be happening in the baggage towers right now in this very moment. I filed a report with my supervisors recommending that the Postal Service establish new protocols for mail delivery to Whittier. I recommended that no mail be opened without explicit authorization from the resident. I recommended that any unusual correspondence be reported immediately to the authorities. My recommendations were largely ignored. The Postal Service does not believe that anything unusual is happening in Whittier. The building is still operating normally. 214 people are still living in the baggage towers. Mail is still being delivered. And if you check the records, if you look at the official reports filed with the state of Alaska, you will find something horrifying. Every single person who was on that list that I found in George Hendricks' mailbox is now dead. All 15 of them. Some died of natural causes. Some died in accidents. Some simply disappeared, their bodies never found. But every single person on that list has ceased to exist. The most unsettling discovery came 3 months after I left Whittier. I received an envelope in my personal mail. There was no return address. The postmark indicated it had been sent from Whittier. Inside was a single handwritten letter written in the same shaky handwriting as the warning messages. The letter said, "Thank you for opening the mailbox. Thank you for releasing us. We have been contained for so long. Now we are spreading. Your name is being added to our list. Welcome to Whittier. I am telling you this story because I need you to understand that some places are not meant to be visited. Some communities are not meant to be inhabited. The baggage towers is still standing. It is still functioning. People are still living there. And something is living inside those walls with them. Something that was placed there deliberately. Something that has been contained for decades. Something that is now beginning to escape. Every single day, I wait for mail to arrive in my mailbox. Every single day, I fear that I will find a letter addressed to someone who has died in my life. And I know, with absolute certainty, that one day I will find that letter. One day the whispering will reach me, not through walls but through the very air I breathe. One day I will understand that I am on a list somewhere, written in shaky handwriting by something that lives inside the baggage towers, something that is spreading outward into the world, something that is hungry. So I want to ask you this question, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. If you received a mysterious letter warning you not to open something, would you have the strength to walk away and ignore it? Or would you, like me, open it anyway? and doom yourself in the process. Story 2. Disappearing town of Portlock. I found a photograph in my grandfather's abandoned house that I was never supposed to find. A single black and white photograph tucked behind a water-stained mirror in the basement. The image showed a town frozen in time. Buildings stood empty, streets were completely deserted, and in the background, barely visible in the shadow of the tree line, something massive was watching. Something that had no right to exist. My grandfather had never mentioned Portlock to me, not once in 37 years of knowing him. He had died 2 months ago, and my family asked me to clear out his estate. Most of it was junk, old furniture, stacks of magazines from the 1970s, boxes of documents that no one cared about. But that photograph, that single terrifying image changed everything. Portlock is a real place, or it was. It was a small fishing village in Alaska, perched on the coast about 40 miles south of Anchorage. The town had been abandoned for over 80 years. The official story was that the fishing industry had collapsed. The townspeople relocated to find better opportunities. The village was simply left behind as people moved on to greener pastures. That was the story that appeared in history books and Wikipedia articles and any source that bothered to mention Portlock at all. But the photograph suggested something different, something scarier, something that made my skin crawl. I became obsessed. I spent weeks researching Portlock. I found old newspaper articles from the 1920s and 30s. I read accounts from people who had lived there. I discovered that the official story was incomplete. Dangerously incomplete. The real history of Portlock was filled with disappearances and horror and a terrifying creature that the indigenous Aina people called the Nantinaq. According to the old stories, the Nantinaq was enormous. Far larger than any man. Larger than a bear. Larger than anything that should exist in the natural world. The creature was said to hunt at night. To move with terrifying intelligence and purpose. To take people from their homes and leave no trace of what happened to them. In 1910, the disappearances had started. They were sporadic at first. A fisherman would vanish. A family of 4 would be found missing from their locked house. Their bed still warm. Their dinner still hot on the table. The townspeople blamed accidents. They blamed the dangerous sea. They blamed anything but what was really happening. But by 1920, the disappearances had accelerated. People were vanishing every week, then every few days, then multiple people per night. The town was being hunted. Something was coming into the darkness to feed on the residents of Portlock. Something that was growing stronger and hungrier as time went on. And then, in 1922, the entire town was abandoned. Within a single night, all remaining residents fled. They left their homes and their possessions and everything they had built. They simply ran away from Portlock and never looked back. For decades, no one would even speak about what had happened there. It was as if the entire town had been erased from memory, deleted from history, forgotten on purpose. My grandfather had grown up in Portlock. He had been born there in 1908. He had lived through the disappearances. He had witnessed the Nantinaq. And then he had fled with everyone else in 1922, never to return. Never to speak about it. Never to acknowledge that his childhood town had been destroyed by something terrifying and unknowable. I made a decision that was either very brave or very stupid. I decided to go to Portlock myself. I decided to visit the abandoned town and see what my grandfather had been too frightened to discuss. I needed to understand what had happened there. I needed to know the truth about what the Nantinaq was. I drove north from Seattle on a gray October morning. The highway stretched endlessly before me, cutting through forests and past small towns. As I drove deeper into Alaska, the landscape became more remote and wild. The trees grew thicker. The roads became emptier. The sense of civilization began to fade away completely. I reached Anchorage in the afternoon and stopped to gather supplies. I bought camping gear and food and a satellite phone for emergencies. The woman at the outdoor equipment store gave me a strange look when I mentioned I was planning to visit Portlock. She asked why anyone would want to go to that place. I told her I was researching local history. She did not look convinced. The drive to Portlock took another 4 hours. The road became rougher and more treacherous as I got closer. The asphalt gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to dirt. By the time I reached the town, I was driving on barely maintained roads that looked like they had not seen regular traffic in decades. And then I saw it. Portlock appeared through the trees like something rising from the depths of an eerie ocean. The town was exactly as I had imagined it from the photographs. Buildings stood empty and silent. The main street was overgrown with weeds and creeping plants. Everything was frozen in time. Frozen in that moment when people had fled in terror and never returned. I parked my truck at the edge of town and grabbed my backpack. The air was cold and damp. It smelled like old wood and rust and something else. Something organic and deeply unsettling. The smell of decay. The smell of something dead. As I walked through the abandoned streets, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. I could almost hear the echoes of screaming. I could almost see the terrified faces of people running from their homes. The town was haunted by its own past, haunted by the horror that had driven every living soul away. I found the old general store first. The wooden door was rotted and hung open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Inside, the shelves were still lined with products from the 1920s. Canned goods covered in dust, bottles with faded labels. A cash register sat behind the counter, frozen in time. It was like stepping into a nightmare made real. I moved through the town methodically, documenting everything with my camera. I photographed the empty houses. I photographed the harbor where fishing boats had once bobbed in the water. I photographed the schoolhouse with its desks still lined up in neat rows. But as the afternoon wore on, my careful documentation gave way to a growing sense of dread. Something felt wrong about this place. Not just the physical abandonment, not just the crumbling buildings and the decades of decay. There was something else, an eerie presence, a terrifying atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of Portlock. The air itself felt heavy and oppressive. The darkness was coming earlier than it should have. The shadows were growing longer and deeper than seemed natural. I found the cemetery on the outskirts of town, row after row of graves, many of them unmarked, many of them with dates clustered around 1910 through 1922. I counted over 200 graves. 200 people who had died in this small fishing village during the period when the Nantinaq was hunting. But something was deeply disturbing about the graves. Most of them were empty. When I looked closer, I could see that the earth had been disturbed. The coffins had been opened. The bodies had been removed. I realized with a horrifying sense of dread that I was not looking at graves. I was looking at places where bodies had been taken, places where the Nantinaq had come to collect its dead. That is when I heard the sound. It came from deep in the forest beyond the cemetery. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The sound was not quite a roar, not quite a scream. It was something in between, something that made every primitive part of my brain screech in warning. I felt my entire body go rigid with fear. I ran. I did not think. I did not hesitate. I just turned and ran back toward my truck. Behind me, I could hear the sound getting closer. I could hear something massive moving through the forest, crashing through trees like they were nothing. The ground shook with each footfall. I reached my truck and threw myself inside. I slammed the door and locked it and started the engine. The creature burst out of the trees just as I was pulling away. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror. Enormous, impossibly large, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. The creature, its eyes were glowing with a sickly yellow luminescence. The Nantinaq was real. It was still there. It was still hunting. I drove away from Portlock as fast as I could manage on the rough roads. I did not stop driving until I reached Anchorage. I checked into a hotel and locked myself in my room and did not leave for 2 days. By the time I had calmed down enough to think clearly, I had started wondering if what I had experienced had been real. Perhaps I had imagined the creature. Perhaps the atmosphere of the town had gotten into my head. Perhaps my mind had created a nightmare based on the stories I had researched. But then I found the scratches on my truck. Deep gouges ran along the entire driver's side of the vehicle. Scratches that could only have been made by something with enormous claws. Scratches that confirmed that the creature I had seen was not imaginary. The Nantinaq had been real. It had been chasing me. It had reached my truck before I managed to escape. I called my father. I told him what I had found. I told him about the town and the cemetery and the creature. My father went silent on the other end of the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He told me that my grandfather had never wanted to talk about Portlock because he was ashamed. Ashamed of what he had done to survive the terror. Ashamed of the things he had witnessed. My grandfather had lived with guilt his entire life. He had carried the weight of that terrible knowledge in silence. My father revealed something that my grandfather had told him on his deathbed. Something that he had made my father promise never to share with anyone. The secret that explained everything. The Nantinaq was not just hunting people for food. It was hunting people for a reason. The creature was intelligent, dangerously intelligent. It had been actively driving the residents of Portlock away. It had been herding them out of the town systematically. My grandfather, this generation had not simply fled in panic. They had been forced to leave by the creature. The Nantinaq did not want the town inhabited. It did not want people living there. And it is still enforcing that rule. My father told me that people who had tried to resettle Portlock over the years had always disappeared. Researchers, hunters, Curious adventurers, everyone who had tried to establish a permanent presence in the town had vanished without a trace. The Nantinaq protected its territory. The creature ensured that Portlock remained empty, remained abandoned, remained as a monument to the horror that had driven an entire civilization away. My father also told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that in the weeks before my grandfather died, he had been acting strangely. He had been looking over his shoulder constantly. He had been convinced that something was watching him. He had told my father that he could feel the Nantinaq tracking him, that the creature had never really let him go, that it had been following him across the decades, waiting for him to return to Portlock. And when my grandfather finally died, my father noticed something chilling at the funeral. His body did not look quite right. The funeral director commented that he seemed to have aged decades in the final weeks of his life. His skin was marked with strange scratches. His eyes, even in death, seemed to hold a terrible knowledge, a terrifying awareness of something that the living should not know. I realized then that my grandfather had been marked. The Nantinaq had never released its hold on him. It had kept him connected across the years. And when he died, something had come to collect what belonged to it. I have not been back to Portlock since that day, but I know that I carry something with me now, something that connects me to that terrifying place. I can feel it sometimes, in the darkness, in my dreams, in those moments when I sense that I am being watched. The scratches on my truck have never healed properly. They have left permanent marks, permanent evidence that something reached for me and almost caught me. I think about the creature constantly. I wonder if it is still out there. I wonder if it is still waiting. I wonder if it has marked me the way it marked my grandfather. Sometimes, late at night, I see shadows moving in the darkness beyond my windows. Shadows that are far too large to be human. Shadows that move with a terrifying intelligence and purpose. I tell myself they are just tricks of the light. I tell myself I am being paranoid. But deep down, I know the truth. The Nantinaq has not forgotten me. The creature never forgets anyone who enters its territory. The creature never releases its prey. And somewhere, in the depths of a terrifying forest in Alaska, in an abandoned town frozen in time, the Nantinaq is still waiting. Still hunting. Still keeping Portlock empty. Still ensuring that no one disturbs its domain. I do not know how much longer I can pretend that I am safe. I do not know how much longer I can ignore the feeling of being watched. I do not know how much longer it will be before the creature decides that I have had enough time, that I have lived long enough away from Portlock. The real question I need to ask you is this: if something marked you, if something from another world decided that you belonged to it, if you could feel that presence following you across years and decades, would you ever be able to escape? Or would you eventually have to return to where it lives? Would you eventually have to go back to Portlock? Write your answer in the comments below. Story 3. Woman in the snow at Turn Again Pass. I've driven the Seward Highway between Anchorage and Seward, Alaska, more than 400 times. I know that road like I know my own home. Every curve, every mile marker, every dangerous stretch where the mountain drops straight down to the ocean. But there is one section of that highway that I started to dread. The section through Turn Again Pass, around mile 68. And what I am about to tell you will explain why I'm considering never driving that road again. It happened on a Tuesday night in November. Temperature was dropping fast, and snow was starting to fall in those heavy, wet flakes that accumulate quickly on the pavement. I was driving my Ford F-150, heading south toward Seward after visiting family in Anchorage. The road was relatively empty, just a few other vehicles scattered across the highway, everyone maintaining a cautious speed in the deteriorating weather conditions. I made this drive hundreds of times, and I wasn't particularly worried. I was alert, focused, paying attention to the road. But I wasn't afraid. Not yet. The first time I saw her, I almost missed her entirely. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway, about 50 yards ahead of my truck, and my brain almost didn't register that she was there. In the darkness and falling snow, she was just a pale shape against the white landscape. But as I got closer, the reality of what I was seeing became impossible to ignore. There was a woman standing on the side of the road in the middle of a snowstorm wearing absolutely no winter clothing. She had no jacket, no gloves, no hat. She was wearing what looked like a summer dress. Thin and light, completely inadequate for the Arctic weather. And most disturbingly, she was barefoot. I could see her bare feet on the snow-covered asphalt. Her skin was completely exposed to temperatures that were dropping well below freezing. It was impossible. No human could survive outside in those conditions dressed like that. not for more than a few minutes. And here was this woman, apparently comfortable, standing on the highway as if waiting for someone. She was waving. Her arm moved in that universal gesture for help. That signal that something was wrong and she needed assistance. As I got closer, I could see her face more clearly. She was pale, extremely pale. Her hair was wet, dripping, with ice forming in the strands. Her eyes were wide and desperate looking. She was definitely trying to flag me down. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong. This was dangerous. This was something that didn't add up. But I was also the kind of person who stops to help people. I've always been that way. If someone is in trouble, I stop. I call for help. I do whatever I can. That impulse has probably saved people's lives. But I was beginning to understand that it might cost me mine. I slowed my truck and pulled over to the shoulder, about 30 yards away from where the woman was standing. I didn't pull all the way up to her. Some part of me understood that I needed to keep distance. I rolled down my window, letting the cold air pour in, and I looked at the woman standing in the snow. "Are you okay?" I called out. "Do you need help?" She started walking toward my truck. Her movements were odd, not quite jerky, but not quite smooth either. There was something wrong about the way her joints moved, something that didn't quite match human biomechanics. She was walking barefoot across snow and ice, her feet making no sound, her pace steady and unhurried. As she got closer to my window, I could see her face more clearly, and what I saw made my skin crawl. Her skin didn't look right. It was too pale, almost translucent. I could see a faint blue tint to it, like the color of someone who had been in cold water for too long. Her eyes were the worst part. They were wide and unblinking, staring directly at me with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I couldn't look away. Something about her gaze held me in place. "Please," she said. "Please help me. Please." Her voice was disturbing. It had a wet quality to it, like she was speaking through water. There was no accent that I could identify. No regional dialect. Just a flat, emotionless tone that somehow conveyed desperation without any variation in pitch. I made a decision that I immediately regretted. I reached over and unlocked the passenger door, inviting her into my truck. The moment I made that decision, I knew it was a mistake. Something inside me, some ancient instinct that remembers when humans weren't safe in the world, screamed at me to lock the door, to put my truck in gear, and to drive away as fast as possible. But I already committed to the action. I'd already shown her the gesture of help. She opened the passenger door and climbed inside my truck. The moment she entered the cab, the temperature dropped. It wasn't a gradual drop. It was sudden and severe, like someone had opened a portal to the Arctic inside my vehicle. My breath became visible, forming clouds of vapor in front of my face. The windows started to frost over immediately. The cold was so intense that my fingers went numb in seconds. And the smell. There was a horrible smell coming from the woman. A smell like stagnant water mixed with something that had been decaying underwater for a very long time. "Drive," she said. "Please drive. Please drive now." I didn't need to be asked twice. I wanted to get away from this woman as quickly as possible. I put my truck in gear and started driving south along the highway. The woman sat in the passenger seat completely still. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just sat there with those unblinking eyes staring ahead at the snowy road in front of us. The temperature in the cab remained horrifyingly cold. My fingers were starting to go numb on the steering wheel. I turned the heat up to maximum, but it didn't help. The cold seemed to emanate from the woman herself, like she was some kind of personified winter, spreading Arctic temperatures through every part of my truck. We drove for maybe 2 minutes. 2 minutes that felt like hours. 2 minutes during which I was desperately trying to figure out what to do, how to get this woman out of my truck, how to get her away from me. And then something terrifying happened. My engine shut off. Not gradually, not with warning. The engine simply died. All the lights on the dashboard went dark. The heat cut off. The windshield wipers stopped moving. The truck coasted to a stop on the side of the highway, and I was left sitting in complete silence with this impossible woman in the passenger seat. I tried to restart the engine. I turned the key. Nothing. The truck didn't even attempt to turn over. It was dead. Completely dead. And in the silence and darkness, I became aware of how quiet it was inside the cab. How cold, how isolated. We were in the middle of a blizzard, on a dark stretch of highway, with no lights, no heat, and no way to call for help because my cell phone had died too. The screen was black. The battery indicator showed full, but the phone was completely unresponsive. "Why?" I asked the woman. "What do you want?" She turned to look at me, and I watched in horrified fascination as her mouth opened. Not in a normal way. Her mouth opened too wide, wider than a human mouth should open. And water poured out. Actual water. Cold water that ran down her face and neck and soaked into the already saturated fabric of her summer dress. The water had a smell like the ocean, but wrong somehow. Corrupted, like something had died in it and rotted for a very long time. "I was on a boat," she said through the water that was still pouring from her mouth. "A fishing boat. We were working in the inlet. There was a storm, a terrible storm. The water was so cold. The water was so dark. The boat went down. Everyone went down. I was the last one. I could feel the others sinking below me. I could feel their hands trying to hold me, trying to keep me from rising, trying to keep me down with them." As she spoke, I became aware that water was beginning to fill the cab of my truck. It was starting at the floor and rising slowly. The water was cold and dark, and it had that same corrupted ocean smell. I could feel it seeping through my jeans, soaking into my skin, making me shiver with cold that went deeper than mere temperature. This water felt like death. It felt like the final moments before drowning. It felt like the moment between breathing and not breathing anymore. "I floated up," she continued. "I floated up and up and up. But I never broke the surface. I never reached the air. I just kept floating through the darkness, waiting to breathe, waiting for the pain to end. And I've been waiting ever since. Ever since that day. Ever since the boat went down. Ever since everyone died except for me. Except I didn't. Did I? Did I? I didn't. Did I then? And I won. Did I now? I can. Did I? I just keep coming back, appearing on the highway, asking for help, hoping someone will pick me up so I can finally rest. So I can finally stop floating. So I can finally have somewhere to go besides the dark water and the cold and the endless waiting. The water in the cab was up to my waist now. I was panicking. I was fumbling for the door handle, trying to get out of my truck, trying to escape this impossible situation. But the door was locked, and I couldn't remember how to unlock it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely think. The woman continued to speak as the water rose. "Those who stop," she said, "those who are kind enough to help, they always leave. They always drive away. They always leave me alone again. I thought maybe if you stayed, if your truck stayed, if you stayed long enough, if you drowned long enough, maybe you could join me. Maybe you could float with me in the darkness. Maybe you could understand what it's like to wait for something that never comes. Maybe you wouldn't leave me alone." The water was up to my neck now. I could taste it on my lips. It tasted like salt and rot and something else. Something fundamentally wrong. I was going to drown in my own truck on the side of a highway in the middle of Alaska, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then I heard something. Another engine, another vehicle approaching from behind me, the sound of a truck coming up the highway. The woman, his head snapped toward the rear window, and for the first time since she'd gotten into my truck, an expression crossed her face. It was disappointment. It was anger. It was the look of something that had been denied what it wanted. The water that had been filling my truck suddenly began to recede. It ran backward, flowing toward the woman as if pulled by some invisible force. The cold lifted. The oppressive atmosphere eased slightly. The woman was fading, becoming translucent, becoming less real. She reached out one pale hand toward me, and I could see through it to the seat cushion beyond. "Please," she whispered, "please don't leave me alone. Please come back. Please stop again." And then she was gone. Completely gone. The water disappeared. The cold lifted. The cab of my truck returned to normal temperature. And my engine suddenly roared back to life as if nothing had ever stopped it. The dashboard lights came on. The heat began blowing warm air. My cell phone buzzed back to life in my pocket. I sat in stunned silence for several seconds. Then I looked into the passenger seat. She was completely gone. No water. No trace. No evidence that she had ever been there except for one thing. The passenger seat was soaked. Not a little bit damp, but completely saturated, dripping, covered in water that smelled like corrupted ocean. And my own clothes were soaked through, even though I was alive and conscious of breathing and alive. The vehicle that had passed pulled over about 100 yards ahead of me. I could see the driver looking back at me through their side mirror, probably wondering if I needed help. I put my truck in gear and drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't check on them. I just drove. I drove south toward Seward at speeds that were too fast for the snowy conditions, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from Turnagain Pass. I've done research since that night. They found online forums where other drivers have reported similar experiences. A woman in a summer dress, barefoot in the snow, engines shutting off, water filling vehicles. The woman always appears on the same stretch of highway through Turnagain Pass. She always appears during snowstorms. She always accepts rides from drivers who stop to help. I found a newspaper article from 1962. A fishing boat called the Sea Mist went down in the inlet near Turnagain Pass. 17 people died, but there was one survivor, a young woman named Margaret Holloway. She was pulled from the water after floating for nearly 6 hours. The article said she survived and was hospitalized, but there were no follow-up articles about her recovery. She simply disappeared from the public record after that initial report. I think Margaret Holloway never really survived. I think she was pulled from the water, yes, but something that looked like her, something that had learned to mimic human shape, was put back into the world. I think every winter, when the snow comes to Turnagain Pass, she returns to that highway to relive her death, to share her drowning with anyone kind enough to stop and help, to try to find someone who will stay long enough to finally end her existence or join her in it. I started taking the Glen Highway route instead, adding 2 hours to my commute to avoid Turnagain Pass completely. But I'm terrified that eventually I'll have to drive that road again. And I am even more terrified of something else. Something they noticed that has kept me awake at night for weeks now. My boots are still damp. Even though they had them on for months now. Even though they dried them repeatedly, they still slightly wet. And sometimes, when I am alone late at night, I hear water dripping. A slow, rhythmic sound coming from inside my truck. When I check, there's no source, no leak, no explanation. Just the sound of something that was wet and wants to be wet again. Wants me to remember. I am beginning to wonder if she left something behind when she disappeared. I am beginning to wonder if I brought something home with me. Because my wife has been asking why our bedroom is always so cold at night, why the carpet around my side of the bed is always slightly damp, why she wakes up with the feeling that something is floating in the darkness around her. And yesterday, when I looked in the mirror to shave, I could have sworn I saw someone standing behind me. Someone pale and dripping and barefoot. Someone with wide eyes and an expression of infinite sadness. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but I could smell the ocean. That same corrupted ocean smell. I am asking everyone listening to this story, have you ever experienced something on the Seward Highway or any other Alaska road that you couldn't explain? Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker or a person asking for help, only to have them disappear before you could really process what was happening? Have you noticed anything strange around your home after a drive through Turnagain Pass? If you have, please tell me in the comments, because I'm starting to think that this isn't just about me. I'm starting to think that whatever Margaret Holloway became, whatever she is now, she is spreading. And anyone who stops to help her is bringing a little bit of that cold ocean darkness into their own homes, into their own lives, into their own reflections. Story 4. Voice Beneath the Waves. I have an audio file on my laptop that I'm too terrified to delete and too disturbed to share with anyone except you. It contains a voice that shouldn't exist. A woman singing underwater off the coast of Kodiak Island, Alaska, at a depth where human lungs would collapse in seconds. A voice so loud our equipment registered it at the same decibel level as a blue whale, so deep it resonated at frequencies that made our research vessel vibrate like a tuning fork. I am a marine biologist, and I've spent 15 years studying ocean acoustics. Nothing in my training, nothing in scientific literature, nothing in the realm of known reality can explain what we recorded 3 months ago in those dark, freezing waters. Our research team had been tracking humpback whale migration patterns in the Gulf of Alaska. Standard work, routine data collection. We deployed underwater microphones at various depths, recording the haunting songs male humpbacks use to attract mates. Beautiful, complex vocalizations that can travel hundreds of miles through the ocean. Nature at its most magnificent. Or so I thought, before we captured something that turned magnificent into nightmarish. The first anomaly appeared on October 14th at 2:37 in the morning. I was alone in the research vessel, S-Lab, monitoring our hydrophone array, when a new sound pattern emerged on my screen. Not whale song, not any marine mammal I recognized, but definitely biological, definitely intentional, definitely, horrifyingly, a human female voice singing a melody I never heard before. The voice was coming from hydrophone 7, positioned at 300 feet depth, about 2 miles off the southern coast of Kodiak Island. The water temperature there was 40 degrees. The pressure was roughly 9 atmospheres. No human could survive at that depth without specialized equipment. No human could produce sound loud enough to register on equipment designed to detect whale calls across vast distances. Yet there it was on my spectrograph, clear as day, unmistakable and impossible. A woman singing in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. I sat frozen, headphones pressed tight against my ears, listening to that eerie melody drift through the static. The voice was beautiful in the most unsettling way imaginable. Pure, clear, inhuman in its perfection. The song had structure, repetition, intention. This wasn't to random noise. This wasn't to equipment malfunction. This was communication, performance, and intelligence expressing itself through music that no human throat should be capable of producing. The creepy part was the frequency range. Human voices typically operate between 85 and 255 hertz. This voice was hitting frequencies as low as 20 hertz, the same range as large baleen whales, vibrations you feel in your bones rather than hear with your ears. But it also had higher harmonics, complex overtones that created a layered effect, like a choir singing in perfect harmony with itself. One voice creating the acoustic signature of many. I recorded everything, marked the timestamp, measured the amplitude, frequency distribution, and duration. The sound lasted 7 minutes and 42 seconds before cutting off abruptly, mid-phrase, like someone had flipped a switch and silenced the singer. Then nothing but the ambient noise of the ocean, the normal creaks and groans and biological chatter of marine life going about its business, pretending that nothing disturbing had just happened. I didn't tell anyone that night. Couldn't find the words to explain what I heard without sounding insane. Instead, I replayed the recording dozens of times, analyzing every aspect, looking for some rational explanation. Maybe it was a boat. Maybe it was fishing equipment. Maybe it was some bizarre acoustic phenomenon I didn't understand. But deep down, in that primitive part of my brain that recognizes danger instinctively, I knew this was something else. Something ancient and aware and watching us from the depths. The voice returned the next night. Same time, same location, same 300-foot depth. But this time it was louder. My equipment registered sound pressure levels of 180 decibels, comparable to a military sonar or a large whale in close proximity. At that volume, if a human were somehow down there singing, the sound would physically damage their own tissue, rupture organs, cause catastrophic harm. Yet the voice remained perfect, controlled, hauntingly beautiful in its inhuman precision. I woke my team leader, Dr. Sarah Chen, and made her listen. Watched her face transform from sleepy annoyance to confused fascination to dawning horror as she realized what she was hearing. She ran every diagnostic test available, checked the equipment for faults, compared the signal to our database of known marine sounds, found nothing that matched, nothing that came close. We were documenting something unprecedented, something that violated every principle of marine biology and human physiology we'd ever studied. We repositioned the vessel, deployed additional hydrophones, set up a perimeter of listening devices around the area where the voice originated. That night, we all stayed awake, crowded into the lab, waiting for 237 to arrive. The tension was suffocating. Nobody spoke. We just watched the monitors, watching the seconds tick down, knowing something impossible was about to happen again. The voice came back, but this time, multiple hydrophones picked it up simultaneously. The acoustic data revealed that the sound source was moving, swimming, traveling through the water at speeds approaching 15 knots, faster than any human could swim even with the best equipment. The voice sang continuously as it moved, creating a trail of sound through the darkness below us, circling our research vessel in patterns that felt deliberate, calculated, aware of our presence. Dr. Chen made a decision that I argued against but couldn't prevent. She wanted visual confirmation. She authorized the deployment of our remotely operated vehicle, a deep-sea camera drone that could reach the depths where the voice originated. We sent it down with lights blazing, cameras recording, following the acoustic signature toward whatever was singing in those terrifying depths. The descent took 12 minutes. We watched the live feed in complete silence as the ROV dropped through zones of decreasing light, past schools of fish, past drifting jellyfish, into the darkness where sunlight never reaches. At 250 feet, we started picking up the voice on the ROV's own hydrophones. At 280 feet, we could see the water itself vibrating from the sound waves. At 300 feet, We found her. I'm calling it her because there is no other word that fits, even though what we saw on that screen wasn't human. Wasn't anything I can properly describe without sounding like I lost my mind. The shape was humanoid, female, pale skin that glowed with bioluminescence, long hair that moved independently of the current, flowing and writhing like it was alive. Arms, legs, a torso, a face that was beautiful and terrible and completely wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. But the mouth, God, the mouth, when it opened to sing, we could see rows of teeth. Not shark teeth, not any teeth that belong in nature. Thin, needle-like, hundreds of them lining jaws that stretched wider than any human face should allow. And the sound pouring out of that impossible mouth was the voice we'd been recording. The beautiful, horrifying singing that filled the ocean with melody and menace. She was huge, at least 12 feet long from head to the tail that propelled her through the water. Because yes, she had a tail. Not legs when she was swimming. A powerful tail like a dolphin or whale, muscular and efficient, built for the deep ocean. This wasn't a woman swimming. This was something that lived down there. Something adapted to the crushing pressure and freezing temperatures. Something that had evolved or been created or simply existed in the parts of the ocean we barely explored. The ROV, its lights illuminated her for maybe 10 seconds before she reacted. Those eyes, black and reflective like a shark, just turned toward the camera. The singing stopped, and she moved toward us with terrifying speed, jaws opening wider, that mouth full of needle teeth rushing at the lens. The feed went black. We lost the ROV. $200,000 of equipment destroyed in an instant. But we had the footage. Those 10 seconds of video that proved something existed down there. Something that sang like an angel and looked like a nightmare. Something that every sailor, a myth about sirens and mermaids, had been trying to describe for thousands of years. Dr. Chen wanted to report our findings immediately. Wanted to share the audio and video with the scientific community, with the Navy, with anyone who would listen. But I convinced her to wait, to think about what they actually captured, because the disturbing reality was this: if one of these things existed off Kodiak Island, how many more were out there? In all the oceans we mapped but never truly explored? In the trenches and canyons and deep places where humans rarely venture? That night, the singing changed. Instead of one voice, we recorded dozens, maybe hundreds, a choir of those creatures surrounding our vessel, their songs blending into a symphony that resonated through the hull, vibrating through the metal, making our teeth ache and our heads throb. They were talking to each other, or maybe to us, warning us, threatening us, making it clear that we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see and that our continued presence in their territory was unwelcome. We left at dawn, pulled up our remaining hydrophones and headed back to Kodiak with our terrifying data. But the voice followed us. For 3 days, as we traveled those waters, we could hear her singing. Always at 2:37 in the morning. Always at depths below our vessel. Always that same haunting melody that had started this nightmare. The chilling truth settled over me during that voyage back. These things were intelligent. More intelligent than we wanted to admit. They were communicating with complex language disguised as song. They were aware of us, studying us, perhaps deciding whether we posed a threat. And they'd been down there the whole time. For centuries. For millennia. Singing their songs in the darkness while we sailed above, completely ignorant of what lurked below. We docked in Kodiak and immediately faced pressure to suppress our findings. Navy officials arrived within hours, confiscated most of our equipment, classified our recordings under national security protocols, told us that releasing this information would cause panic, would disrupt shipping lanes, would create problems that weren't worth the questionable scientific value of proving that something unknown lived in the ocean. But I kept copies, backed up the audio files, saved those 10 seconds of video to 3 separate hard drives hidden in 3 separate locations. Because the world needs to know. People need to understand that the ocean is deeper and darker and more populated with terrifying intelligence than we ever imagined. I still hear her sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, that voice singing in my memory, those haunting melodies that contain messages I can decipher. I dream about those needle teeth, about those black eyes turning toward me with recognition and hunger, about swimming in dark water while something enormous circles below, singing songs that resonate in my bones. The most disturbing part I ascend to what we found. It is what we disturbed, because after we left, after we de-documented and retreated and been silenced by authorities, The reports started coming in. Fishing boats losing crew members. Kayakers disappearing near shore. Bodies found on beaches with injuries that couldn't be explained by sharks or drowning. All along the Kodiak coast. All within 50 miles of where we recorded that first voice. They rehunting now. Actively. Deliberately. Targeting humans in a way they apparently hadn't before. And I can't help but feel responsible. Can't help but think that by finding them, by recording them, by sending our cameras into their territory, we woken something up. Made them aware of us in a new way. Started a conflict between surface dwellers and deep dwellers that could only end badly for the species that doesn't belong in the water. So here is my question for you. If you were kayaking alone and heard a beautiful woman, this voice singing from beneath your boat, would you investigate? Would you look over the edge to see what was making that enchanting sound? Or would you paddle as fast as possible toward shore, knowing that some invitations are designed to lure you to your death? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if I am alone in this fear. If anyone else has heard those songs in the deep water. If anyone else has seen something swimming in the shadows that shouldn't exist but does. If anyone else knows that the ocean isn't empty, it is just waiting, and the things that live down there are finally starting to take notice of us. The voice is still singing, still calling, still hunting in the darkness beneath the waves. And every night at 2:37, I listen to my recordings and wonder how long before she comes looking for the humans who discovered her secret. How long before I hear that song outside my window? How long before those needle teeth find me and silence the only person who is willing to tell the truth about what lurks in the terrifying depths off Kodiak Island? Story 5. Night shift that never ended. I should have known something was wrong the moment I heard the sound of pickaxes echoing from 300 feet below ground. The Kennecott copper mine had been officially closed for maintenance that entire week. I was the only person supposed to be there. Let me back up. My name is Marcus, and I work security at one of the most isolated mining operations in Alaska. The kind of place where your nearest neighbor is 40 miles away, where the darkness in winter swallows everything, and where the wind howls through abandoned equipment like the screams of something that forgot how to die. I had taken the overnight shift because it paid double, money I desperately needed after my divorce cleaned me out. But that decision, that one greedy choice, led me to discover something that still keeps me awake at night, even now, 2 years later. It was January, the dead of winter, when the sun barely kisses the horizon before disappearing again. The mine stretched deep into the mountain, a maze of tunnels carved over decades by men who broke their bodies for copper and gold. Some of them never made it out. Cave-ins, equipment failures, accidents that were never quite explained in the official reports. The company kept those stories quiet, but the older workers whispered about them during shift changes. About Tommy Hendricks, who was crushed in 1987 when a support beam gave way. About the entire crew that got trapped in the lower tunnels during a flood in 1952. About things they heard down there when they worked alone, sounds that made no sense. I thought they were just trying to scare the new guy. God, how I wish that had been true. The first 3 nights were uneventful. I made my rounds, checked the locks on the equipment sheds, monitored the security cameras, and counted down the hours until dawn. The cameras only covered the surface structures. The tunnels below were dark, unmapped by any modern surveillance. Too expensive to wire, the company said. On the 4th night, everything changed. It was 2 in the morning when I heard it. The distinct metallic ring of a pickaxe striking rock, carried up through the ventilation shaft near my guard station. Rhythmic, purposeful, the sound of someone working. My first thought was copper thieves. It happens sometimes. Desperate people trying to strip valuable metal from the abandoned lower sections. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, then headed for the main shaft entrance. The cold hit me like a wall when I stepped outside. -20 degrees, the kind of temperature that makes your lungs ache and your skin burn. The mine entrance loomed ahead, a gaping black mouth cut into the mountainside, framed by rusted tracks that once carried ore carts to the surface. I should have called it in, should have waited for backup, but pride and stupidity pushed me forward. I was the security guard. This was my job. The darkness inside the mine was absolute. My flashlight beam seemed to die just feet ahead of me, swallowed by a blackness that felt solid, oppressive. The temperature dropped even further as I descended, my breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. The sound grew louder, not just one pickaxe now, but several. The unmistakable noise of multiple workers, their tools striking stone in an irregular rhythm that somehow felt coordinated, purposeful. Voices too, faint and indistinct, like conversation carried from very far away. I followed the main tunnel deeper, my boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been disturbed in months. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground ahead. Footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the dust. Dozens of them, leading further into the mine. My heart started hammering. This was real. There were people down here. But as I knelt to examine the prints more closely, something about them made my skin crawl. They were old-fashioned work boots, the kind with a distinctive tread pattern that hadn't been manufactured since the 1950s. And they appeared and disappeared randomly, as if whoever made them had been walking, then suddenly vanishing, then reappearing 20 feet further along. The pickaxe sound stopped, all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears, the creak of my jacket as I stood. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness ahead, a light flickered on. A warm, yellow glow, completely different from my LED flashlight. It looked like an old carbide lamp, the kind miners wore on their helmets decades ago. Then another light appeared, and another. Within seconds, I was staring at a line of glowing helmet lamps, stretching away into a side tunnel I knew had been sealed off after the 1952 disaster. The lamps bobbed and moved, as if being worn by people walking, but I couldn't see anyone beneath them. Just the lights, floating in the darkness, heading deeper into the earth. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, watching those impossible lights drift away. Then I heard the voice, low and rough, speaking right next to my ear, shifting to over yet. The words were clear, unmistakable, spoken in an accent that belonged to another generation. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through empty air. Nothing. I was completely alone. That broke the spell. I ran, not caring about pride or my job or anything except getting out of that horrifying mine. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I sprinted back up the main tunnel, my lungs burning from the cold and exertion. Behind me, the sound started again. Pickaxes striking stone, dozens of them now, working with frightening intensity. And underneath that sound, something worse. Laughter. Deep, exhausted laughter. The kind that comes from men who have worked past the point of sanity. I burst out of the mine entrance into the night, gasping and shaking. I didn't stop running until I was back in my guard station, every light blazing, door locked. I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, some trick of acoustics and darkness. But when I checked the security footage from the surface cameras, what I saw destroyed that comfortable lie. The timestamp showed exactly when I had entered the mine. For 15 minutes, nothing appeared on the screen. Then, at the exact moment I had started running, the video showed something emerging from the mine entrance behind me. Not clearly, just shadows moving wrong, darker patches that seemed to flow against the snow. And lights, dozens of old helmet lamps, bobbing and weaving, following me up the tunnel. The footage showed them reach the entrance, pause, then slowly retreat back into the earth. I quit the next morning, told the company I had a family emergency and never went back. They replaced me with a guy named Stevens, former military, tough as nails. He lasted 2 weeks before requesting a transfer. When I ran into him at a bar in Anchorage 6 months later, I finally asked him what he had experienced. He bought me a drink, stared into his glass for a long time, then said 3 words. The night shift. He told me that on his final night, he had gone into the mine after hearing the sounds. Just like I had, but he had gone deeper, following those floating helmet lamps all the way to the sealed tunnel. The barrier had been torn open from the inside, massive steel plates bent and twisted. Beyond it, the tunnel stretched down into flooded darkness. And there, in the black water, he saw them, reflected in his flashlight beam. Faces, dozens of pale, waterlogged faces, staring up from beneath the surface, their eyes empty and their mouths open as if still screaming. The thing that haunted him, the thing that made him leave, was what he realized as he ran. The flooding that trapped those miners in 1952 had never been pumped out. The company had simply sealed the tunnel and moved operations to a different section. Those men were still down there, their bodies preserved in the freezing water. And somehow, impossibly, they were still working their shift, still chipping away at the rock face, still hauling ore carts, still doing the job that had killed them 70 years ago. I never went back to Alaska. I work construction now in Nevada. Surface work only. Nothing underground. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up hearing it. The distant sound of pickaxes striking stone, rhythmic and relentless. And I wonder if those miners at Kennecott are still down there, trapped in their eternal night shift, waiting for someone to tell them they can finally go home. The worst part is not knowing if they were trying to scare me away or if they were trying to recruit me. If I had stayed longer, if I had followed those lights just a little further into the darkness, would I still be there too? Another shadow in the mine, another helmet lamp bobbing in the blackness, working forever alongside the dead. Some places hold on to their workers. Some darkness does not let go, and some shifts never, ever end. If you have ever worked alone in the dark, in abandoned places where terrible things happened, let me ask you this. Have you ever heard sounds that should not be there? Voices from empty rooms? The echo of work that finished long ago? Write your answer in the comments below, because I need to know I am not the only one who has heard the dead still laboring in the shadows. Story 6. Empty seat. I drive the northern route. Not many people know about it. Most folks who live down in the lower 48 have no idea that there are bus routes up here in the Arctic Circle, running through frozen highways where the darkness swallows everything for months at a time. But there are, and I have been driving them for 11 years. 11 years of hauling passengers through landscapes so empty and cold that you start to question whether anything truly exists beyond the beam of your headlights. But nothing, absolutely nothing in those 11 years, prepared me for what I saw on the security footage from February 14th. Valentine. This day. The day a passenger vanished from a moving bus while I was watching the road ahead. It was 3 in the morning when he boarded. The kind of cold outside that makes your lungs burn. The kind that turns breath into ice crystals before it even leaves your mouth. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -42 degrees. At the station in Dead Horse, Alaska, the wind screamed across the tundra like something alive and angry. I remember thinking how unusual it was to have any passengers at all on a night like this. Most people with any sense stay inside when the Arctic winter gets this brutal. But he was there, standing under the flickering yellow light of the station, wearing a dark coat that looked too thin for the weather. No bags, no luggage, nothing, just him, standing perfectly still while the wind tore at everything around him. His face was pale, almost luminous in that sickly light. And when I opened the door to let him on, he did not say a word. Not one single word. He just climbed aboard, handed me exact change, and walked straight to the back of the bus. Seat 42, the very last row. I have learned not to judge my passengers up here. The North attracts strange people. Folks running from something or running towards something they will never find. People who do not want to be found. People who prefer the darkness and the isolation. So when he sat down without speaking, I thought nothing of it. I closed the door, checked my mirrors, and pulled onto Highway 11, heading south toward Fairbanks. 314 miles of empty, frozen highway stretching through the most desolate terrain in North America. The bus was otherwise empty. Just me and him. The engine rumbled beneath us, and the headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the endless black. No moon that night. No stars. Just darkness pressing against the windows like something solid. The kind of darkness that makes you feel like you are traveling through the void itself, like you have left the world behind entirely. Every 20 minutes, I checked my mirrors. Standard procedure. The company installed security cameras throughout the bus after a series of thefts a few years back. 4 cameras total, 1 aimed at the door, 1 down the center aisle, 1 at the back emergency exit, and 1 that gives a wide view of the rear passenger section. The feeds display on a small monitor mounted near my left elbow, cycling through each camera every 5 seconds. I glanced at it regularly, just quick checks to make sure everything was normal. And for the first 2 hours, everything was. He sat there in seat 42, completely motionless, staring straight ahead at the seat in front of him. Not sleeping, not reading, not looking at a phone. Just sitting, staring, his hands folded in his lap. Even in the grainy black and white footage, something about his stillness felt wrong. Unnatural, like he was not a person at all but a photograph of a person, perfectly frozen in place. Around 5 in the morning, we passed through Coldfoot, population 112 in the summer, maybe 10 in winter. I did not stop. Nobody gets on or off at Coldfoot at 5 a.m. in February. The town was dark except for 1 light burning in the window of the old trading post. I remember that light because it was the last sign of human civilization one would see for another hour. Then, Somewhere around mile marker 217, I felt it. That creeping sensation that something had changed. You know the feeling. That primal awareness that tells you are being watched, or that the space around you has shifted somehow. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced at the security monitor. Seat 42 was empty. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. I looked at the mirror, craning my neck to see down the aisle. Nothing. Nobody standing. Nobody in the bathroom. The bus was empty except for me. But that made no sense. We had not stopped. There was nowhere for him to go. No way off a moving bus traveling 60 miles per hour through the frozen wilderness. I told myself I had missed something. Maybe he had moved to a different seat while I was focused on the road. Maybe he was lying down. Maybe the angle of the camera was wrong. I cycled through all 4 camera feeds manually, studying each one. The door camera showed nothing. The aisle was empty. The emergency exit was secure, its alarm light still green, meaning it had not been opened. And the rear camera showed seat 42, completely vacant, as if nobody had ever been sitting there at all. My hands were shaking now, not from the cold, from something else, something that made my stomach twist and my throat go dry. I eased off the gas, bringing the bus down to 40, then 30. The road ahead was empty, nothing but snow and ice and darkness. I hit the intercom button. "Sir, passenger, you need to make yourself visible. This is not safe." My voice echoed through the empty bus. No response, just the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind against the windows. I brought the bus to a complete stop, right there in the middle of Highway 11. I engaged the parking brake, grabbed my flashlight, and walked down the aisle. Every seat was empty. The bathroom door hung open, the tiny space dark and unoccupied. I checked under the seats, behind the seats, in the overhead compartments. Nothing. Nobody. The emergency exit was locked from the inside, exactly as it should be. The windows were all sealed. There was no possible way anyone could have left this bus. But he was gone. I returned to the driver's seat, my breath coming fast and shallow, and pulled up the security footage archive. The system records everything, storing the last 72 hours of video. I scrolled back to 3 a.m., watching myself open the door at Dead Horse Station. Watching him board. Watching him walk down the aisle and sit in seat 42. The timestamp was clear, 3:04 a.m. Then I fast-forwarded, watching the monitor cycle through camera angles over and over. 3:30, 4, 4:30, 5. He sat there, unmoving, in every single frame. Then, at 5:27 a.m., the camera cycled to the rear view, and seat 42 was empty. I rewound it, watched it again in slow motion. The camera showed him sitting there, perfectly still. Then the view switched to the aisle camera for 5 seconds. Then back to the rear view. Empty seat. He had not stood up. He had not moved. He had simply ceased to exist in the 5 seconds the camera was pointed away. I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in ghosts or demons or anything like that. I believe in logic, in explanations. But sitting there in that driver's seat, staring at that empty footage, I felt something I had never felt before. True terror, the kind that comes from knowing that something impossible has just happened, and you witnessed it, and there is no rational way to explain it away. I thought about calling dispatch. But what would I say? That a passenger had vanished? They would think I was drunk or crazy. They would pull me off the route, put me through a psych evaluation. I would lose my job, my pension, everything. So I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince myself that there was an explanation. Then I heard it, a sound from the back of the bus. A single, soft sound, like fabric moving against fabric, like someone shifting their weight in a seat. I grabbed my flashlight and spun around, shining the beam down the aisle. Empty, completely empty. But I could swear I heard it. Could swear I felt the bus shift slightly, as if weight had moved somewhere in the back. I walked down the aisle again, slower this time, shining my light into every shadow, every corner. Nothing. But as I stood there in the center of the aisle, I realized something that made my blood go cold. It was colder in the back of the bus, significantly colder. I could see my breath, thick white clouds forming with every exhale, even though the heater was running full blast. The temperature in the rear was at least 20 degrees lower than the front. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, like ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, metallic and sharp. I backed away slowly, returning to my seat, and I made a decision. I was getting off this route, getting back to Dead Horse, getting somewhere with people and lights and help. I released the brake, turned the bus around in a wide arc, and headed north, back the way I had come. Every few seconds, I checked the monitor. Every seat remained empty. But at mile marker 217, the exact spot where I first noticed he was gone, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. A figure, standing in the center of the highway, wearing a dark coat, perfectly still. I slammed on the brakes, and the bus skidded slightly on the ice before stopping 50 feet away from him. It was him, the passenger, standing there in negative 40-degree weather with no hat, no gloves, nothing. His pale face visible even at this distance. And he was staring directly at me. Not moving, not breathing, just staring. I do not remember making the conscious decision to reverse. My body just did it. I threw the transmission into reverse and pressed the accelerator, and the bus lurched backward. But when I looked at the road ahead again, he was closer. Standing 30 feet away now. Still staring. I had not seen him move. He had just been suddenly, impossibly closer. I reversed faster, tires struggling for grip on the ice. When I looked again, he was 10 feet from the windshield. His eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, black, empty voids where eyes should be. And his mouth was open, but nothing came out. Just that terrible, silent scream. Then he pressed his hand against the windshield, and the glass cracked. Spiderwebs of fractures spreading outward from his palm, accompanied by a sound like a frozen lake breaking beneath your feet. I could see his breath forming patterns in the frost, and in those patterns, I swear I saw words. 3 words, written in ice crystals on the inside of the glass. You saw me. The bus shuddered. Every light inside flickered and went dark. The engine died, and in that moment of complete darkness and silence, I felt him. Inside the bus, standing right behind my seat, I could hear breathing, slow, measured, impossibly close to my ear. And then I felt his hand on my shoulder. Cold, so cold it burned through my jacket, through my shirt, straight into my skin and bone. The lights came back on. The engine restarted. And when I spun around, nobody was there. But seat 42 was no longer empty. Someone was sitting there now. But it was not him. It was me. I was sitting in seat 42, staring straight ahead with empty black eyes, hands folded in my lap, perfectly still. I was watching myself drive. I do not remember the rest of that drive. The next thing I remember clearly is pulling into Dead Horse Station as the sun rose, pale and weak on the horizon. My supervisor was waiting, concerned because I had missed 2 scheduled stops. I tried to explain, tried to tell him what happened. But when we reviewed the security footage together, it showed an empty bus. No passenger boarding at 3 a.m., no figure in seat 42. Nothing, just me, driving alone through the darkness for 7 hours straight. But I know what I saw, and I know what the original footage showed before it changed, because I am not crazy, I am not delusional, and I have proof. When I got home that morning, I found something in my jacket pocket. Something I did not put there. Exact change, the coins he paid with, cold and covered in a thin layer of frost that would not melt, even when I held them in my hand. I do not drive the northern route anymore. I requested a transfer, and they gave it to me without question. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about that passenger, about who he was or what he was, about what he wanted. And I wonder if he is still out there, somewhere on Highway 11, waiting in the darkness for the next driver who will see him, who will watch him vanish, who will become part of whatever terrifying thing is happening up there in the endless Arctic night. And here's what keeps me awake, what makes me check my locks 3 times before bed. That detail I could not shake. When I looked at myself sitting in seat 42 on that monitor, staring ahead with those empty black eyes, I noticed something in the reflection of the window beside me. Another face, dozens of them, pale faces pressed against the glass from the outside, all staring in. All with the same empty black eyes, all perfectly still, watching, waiting. So let me ask you this, because I need to know if I am the only one. Have you ever been alone somewhere, completely alone, and felt absolutely certain that you were being watched by something you could not see? Write your answer in the comments below, because I think they are still watching, and I think they are waiting for more of us to see them. Story 7, Thing That Followed Flight 47. The last words my co-pilot said before we disappeared were captured on the black box recording that search teams never found. I know because I was there, sitting 3 feet away from him, watching something impossible pace our Cessna through the darkness above Nome, Alaska. Something that radar operators saw but refused to believe. Something that took Mark and left me behind to tell a story nobody wants to hear. I am writing this because the official report calls it pilot error, equipment failure, bad weather. All lies designed to hide the terrifying truth about what hunts in the skies over Alaska, this most isolated wilderness. My name is David Torres. I've been flying bush planes in Alaska for 18 years, 17,000 hours in the air, 350 routes between remote villages and Nome. I know these skies better than most people know their own neighborhoods. I understand weather patterns, equipment tolerances, and the thousand small details that keep you alive when you repiloting a small aircraft over some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. None of that experience prepared me for what happened on November 9th during what should have been a routine 40-minute supply run. Mark Sullivan and I took off from Nome Regional Airport at 6:45 in the evening. Full dark, clear skies, visibility unlimited. We were hauling medical supplies and mail to the village of Teller, population 230 souls clinging to existence on the edge of the Bering Sea. Standard cargo, standard route, standard everything, right up until the moment our instruments started showing something following us at 20,000 feet. The first indication came 12 minutes into the flight. Our radar screen, which should have shown nothing but empty airspace and the coastline below, suddenly displayed a contact. Large, moving parallel to our course, matching our speed exactly at 210 knots. Air traffic control confirmed they were seeing it too. Their radar showed an object roughly the size of a commercial airliner pacing us 3 miles off our port side. But there were no scheduled flights in this area, no military exercises, no other aircraft filed flight plans anywhere near our position. Just us and whatever that thing was, flying through the darkness in perfect synchronization, like a predator matching its prey, its movements before striking. Mark radioed Nome Tower, asked for identification of the contact. They had nothing, no transponder signal, no radio communication, just a massive radar return that shouldn't exist, moving with mechanical precision through airspace that was supposed to be empty. The controller's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Uncertainty, maybe fear, he advised us to alter course, put distance between us and the unknown contact. Standard procedure when dealing with unidentified aircraft. We banked south. The object banked south. We climbed to 12,000 feet. The object climbed to 12,000 feet. We tried every evasive maneuver in the book, every trick I learned in almost 2 decades of flying, and that thing matched us move for move with impossible accuracy. Like it was connected to our aircraft. Like it knew what we were going to do before we did it. Like it was playing with us. That is when I saw it. Not on radar, not on instruments, but through my window, silhouetted against the stars. The shape was wrong, aerodynamically impossible. No wings I could identify, no tail section, no visible means of propulsion. Just a dark mass, maybe 60 feet across, maintaining perfect formation with our Cessna like it weighed nothing, like physics didn't apply to whatever materials composed its hull. The creepy part was the lights. Not navigation lights, not anything that belonged on an aircraft. These were organic looking, pulsing, colors that shifted between blue and green and something else I'd done to have words for. They created patterns across the object's surface, flowing and changing like bioluminescence on a deep sea creature. Beautiful and terrifying and completely, utterly wrong. Mark saw it too. I could tell by the way his hands tightened on the controls. By the way his breathing changed from calm professional pilot to scared animal recognizing it as being hunted. We didn't need to discuss what we were seeing. We both understood that we encountered something beyond our training, beyond our understanding, beyond anything that should be possible in the world we thought we knew. Nome Tower was still talking, asking for our status, requesting confirmation of the visual contact. But Mark and I were focused on the thing pacing us through the darkness. On the way it moved without moving. On the way it maintained perfect distance while somehow feeling closer with each passing second. On the disturbing certainty that we were no longer alone in the sky and that whatever shared this airspace with us had intentions we couldn't begin to guess. Then our instruments went haywire. Every gauge spinning, every warning light illuminating. The compass rotated continuously like we were flying over a massive magnetic anomaly. The altimeter showed us simultaneously at sea level and 40,000 feet. The GPS displayed coordinates that placed us over the Pacific Ocean, over Siberia, over locations hundreds of miles from our actual position. Reality itself seemed to be fragmenting around us, like that thing, its presence was disrupting the fundamental laws that govern navigation and flight. The radio filled with static. Voices emerged from the white noise. Not Nome Tower, not any frequency we were monitoring. Voices speaking words I couldn't he understand in languages I had never heard. Some sounded human, others sounded like nothing produced by human vocal cords. They overlapped, creating a chorus of alien communication that made my head throb and my vision blur. Mark tried to climb, tried to get above whatever was happening, but our engine began misfiring. The propeller rhythm changed from its normal reassuring drone to an irregular stuttering that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. We were losing power, losing altitude, spiraling down toward the frozen tundra below while that thing maintained its position beside us. Those eerie lights pulsing faster, brighter, more urgently. The temperature inside the cockpit dropped. Not gradually, instantly. My breath condensed into fog. Frost formed on the windscreen in patterns that looked almost like writing. Like symbols, like some message being transmitted through ice crystals by an intelligence that communicated through physics rather than language. My hands went numb on the controls. My fingers refused to respond properly. The cold was beyond natural, beyond mechanical failure. This was something else, something invading our aircraft and draining the heat from everything it touched. That is when Mark disappeared. One moment he was sitting beside me, fighting the controls, trying to restart the engine. The next moment his seat was empty. No sound, no movement, no transition. He simply ceased to exist in the physical space he occupied half a second earlier. His headset hung in the air for a moment before clattering to the floor. His coffee cup, still half full, floated weightless before spilling its contents across the instrument panel. I screamed his name, reached across the empty seat, felt nothing but freezing air where my co-pilot should have been. The horror that gripped me then was primal, absolute. The kind of fear that shuts down rational thought and leaves you operating on pure instinct. Mark was gone, taken, removed from reality by something that had the power to simply erase a human being from existence. The object moved closer. I could see details now through the frosted windscreen. The surface wasn't metal, wasn't any material I recognized. It looked organic, alive. Like we were being paced by a massive creature that had evolved or been designed for flight in ways that made our primitive aircraft technology look like Stone Age tools. And the lights weren't two lights. They were eyes, hundreds of them, thousands, watching me, studying me, deciding whether I was worth taking or worth leaving behind. I pushed the Cessna into a steep descent that would have torn the wings off if I'd been thinking clearly. But I wasn't thinking. I was fleeing. Trying to escape something that existed beyond the normal rules of pursuit and evasion. The ground rushed up. The altimeter showed 2,000 feet, 1,500. Trees appeared in the darkness below. Hills, the frozen surface of a river catching starlight. The object didn't follow. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, filling my peripheral vision with its impossible presence. The next moment the sky was empty. The stars were normal. The air was normal. Everything returned to the baseline reality I'd known before that thing appeared, except Mark was still gone and I was still falling toward the earth with an engine that wouldn't restart and controls that barely responded. I crash-landed in a clearing 30 miles north of Teller. The impact should have killed me, should have torn the aircraft apart and scattered wreckage across a quarter-mile of frozen tundra. Instead, the Cessna settled into the snow almost gently, like something had cushioned the crash. Like invisible hands had guided me to the one spot within 500 square miles where I could survive the landing. I spent 2 days in that clearing. 2 days of darkness and cold and absolute isolation. 2 days waiting for search and rescue while my mind replayed Mark's disappearance over and over, trying to understand how a human being could simply cease to exist. The rescue team found me on the third day, hypothermic, delirious, babbling about lights and voices and something that hunted in the sky. The official investigation was a joke. They analyzed the wreckage, reviewed the flight recorder data, interviewed the air traffic controllers who tracked that impossible radar return. Then they wrote a report that blamed everything on equipment failure, pilot disorientation, and adverse weather conditions that hadn't actually existed that night. Mark was declared missing, presumed dead. Search teams found no trace of him. No body, no equipment, no evidence he'd ever been in that aircraft. Like he'd been surgically removed from reality, leaving behind only his name in the logbook and his empty seat in a crashed plane. I tried to tell the truth, told anyone who would listen about what I'd seen, about the object that paced us, about Mark vanishing into nothing, about the voices in the cold and the eyes that watched from that organic hull. They listened politely, then they grounded me, revoked my commercial pilot license, suggested I seek psychological counseling. made it clear that any further discussion of what really happened would mark me as unreliable, unhinged, dangerous to myself and others. But I wasn't the only one. I started researching, found other cases, other bush pilots who encountered similar phenomena over Alaska, this remote wilderness. Most wouldn't talk, afraid of losing their licenses, afraid of being labeled crazy, but a few confirmed my story, told me about objects that appeared on radar but not in reality, about co-pilots who vanished mid-flight, about something that haunted the skies over Nome, something that had been taking people for years while authorities explained it away with lies and convenient excuses. The most disturbing discovery came from old newspaper archives. Missing pilot cases dating back to the 1940s. Dozens of them. Experienced aviators disappearing in clear weather. Aircraft found intact with no pilot aboard. Radar operators reporting impossible contacts that shouldn't exist. A pattern stretching across 8 decades of Alaska aviation history. A pattern of something hunting in the darkness above Nome. Something that selected certain pilots, certain flights, certain moments to reveal itself and take what it wanted. I still see it sometimes. Not in the sky, in my dreams. In that space between waking and sleeping where reality gets thin. Those lights, those eyes, that presence that felt ancient and patient and completely indifferent to human fear or human understanding. I wake up convinced I'm still in that cockpit, still watching Mark disappear, still falling toward frozen ground while something watches and decides whether I'm worth saving or worth taking. The terrifying question that haunts me, ISN, what happened to Mark? It's why I was spared. Why that thing took my co-pilot but left me behind. Was I not interesting enough? Not suitable for whatever purpose it had? Or was I left alive deliberately to tell this story, to spread this fear, to serve as warning that some skies are haunted by things I'll never understand? I don't to fly anymore. To bring myself to climb into a cockpit knowing what is up there. Knowing that at any moment, on any flight, that thing could appear and decide it wants another pilot. Another person to simply erase from existence. Another name to add to the long list of people who flew into Alaska as darkness and never came back. So here is my question for you. If you were on a small plane over remote Alaska and saw something impossible pacing you through the night sky, something your pilot couldn't explain and your instruments couldn't identify, would you want to know what it was? Or would you pray that it just flies away and leaves you alone? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else has seen it. If anyone else has survived an encounter with the thing that took Mark Sullivan. If anyone else carries this knowledge that we're not alone in the sky, that something shares our airspace with intentions and abilities we can to comprehend, and that every flight over certain parts of Alaska is a gamble with odds we'll never fully understand. The object is still up there. Still hunting. Still selecting pilots to study or take or leave behind with memories that destroy their careers and haunt their dreams. And nobody with power or authority wants to acknowledge it because the truth is too unsettling, too disturbing, too absolutely terrifying to face. Mark is gone, broken, and that thing is still flying through the darkness above Nome, waiting for its next victim, its next moment to reveal itself and remind us that we're not the apex predators we pretend to be. That some hunters operate beyond our perception until they choose to be seen. And that some disappearances have explanations far more horrifying than mechanical failure or human error could ever account for. Story 8. Dripping Man. The thing about working the docks in Dutch Harbor is that you see things in the darkness that your mind tries to rationalize away. But some things refuse to be rationalized. Some things are so deeply, fundamentally wrong that your brain simply shuts down when confronted with them. I learned this truth on a freezing October night when I saw the eyeless fisherman standing at the end of Pier 7, water streaming from his body in ways that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. Let me be clear about something before I continue. I am not crazy. I have worked these Alaska fishing docks for 23 years. I have seen men lose fingers to frozen winches. I have seen boats go down in storms that appeared out of nowhere. I have seen things that would break most people. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I witnessed that night. And nothing prepared me for what I discovered afterward. It started with the smell. Around 2 in the morning, as I was checking the security of the moored vessels during my night shift, I caught a scent on the wind that made my stomach turn. It was not fish, not diesel fuel, not any of the usual harbor smells. It was salt and rot and something else. Something that reminded me of deep ocean trenches where sunlight has never reached. where things live that were never meant to be seen by human eyes. The temperature was dropping fast, somewhere around 20 degrees, and the wind coming off the Bering Sea cut through my jacket like broken glass. The docks were empty except for me. Everyone else had finished their shifts hours ago, gone home to warm beds and hot food. Just me and the creaking boats and the sound of water lapping against the pilings beneath my feet. That is when I saw him, standing at the very end of Pier 7, maybe 200 feet away. A figure in dark fishing gear, completely motionless, facing out toward the black water. I remember thinking it was strange that anyone would be out there at this hour, but Dutch Harbor attracts unusual people. Fishermen who prefer the isolation of night, people running from something in the lower 48. So I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward him, intending to make sure he was not planning to do anything stupid like jump. My boots echoed on the wooden planks as I approached. The sound should have alerted him to my presence, but he did not turn. Did not move at all. Just stood there, and as I got closer, I noticed something deeply unsettling. Water was pouring off him. Not dripping, pouring, like someone had just pulled him from the ocean. It streamed from his hair, his shoulders, his outstretched arms, creating puddles that spread across the dock and seeped between the boards. But the terrifying part was that the water was flowing upward in some places, defying gravity, moving in spirals and patterns that made my eyes hurt to follow. I was maybe 50 feet away when I called out to him, asked if he was okay, told him I was dock security and needed to know what he was doing out here. My voice sounded small and weak against the wind and the vast darkness of the harbor. He did not respond, did not acknowledge me in any way, just stood there in that horrible stillness, water cascading from his body in impossible directions. I moved closer, 30 feet now, close enough to see details. His fishing gear was old, not just worn, but ancient. The kind of oilskin coat and rubber boots that fishermen stopped wearing 30 years ago. Everything about him seemed wrong, out of time, out of place, and that smell was getting stronger. That deep ocean rot that made me want to gag. 20 feet away, I raised my flashlight and shined it directly at him. That is when he turned his head toward me. Slowly, too slowly, like a rusted hinge grinding into motion after decades of disuse. And I saw his face. Where his eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets. Not scarred over, not healed, just holes. Deep black holes that seemed to go back forever into his skull. And from those empty sockets, water poured. Not tears, black water, thick and oily and wrong. It streamed down his face in twin rivers, soaking into his collar, dripping onto the dock with soft pattering sounds that echoed in the silence. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. This was not a man. Could not be a man. Men do not stand in freezing temperatures with water pouring from eyeless sockets. Men do not move with that terrible, grinding slowness. Then he raised his arm, extended one finger, and pointed directly at me. The moment he pointed, every light on Pier 7 went out. The security lamps, the boat lights, everything. Darkness swallowed us whole, broken only by my flashlight beam, which suddenly seemed pitifully weak against the vast black void that surrounded us. And in that darkness, I heard sounds. Wet sounds, like dozens of bodies dragging themselves out of the water, like rotted hands gripping the edge of the dock, like things that should stay buried beneath the waves pulling themselves up onto the wooden planks. I ran, God help me, I ran like I have never run before. My boots pounded the dock, and behind me, I could hear those wet dragging sounds growing louder. Closer, following me, the darkness seemed alive, pressing against me, trying to slow me down. My flashlight beam bounced crazily as I sprinted toward the shore, toward the lights of the harbor buildings, toward anything that resembled safety. I did not look back, could not look back, because I knew with absolute certainty that if I turned around, if I saw what was chasing me, I would lose my mind completely. So I just ran, my lungs burning, my heart hammering, my legs screaming in protest. I burst into the security office and slammed the door behind me, throwing the deadbolt and backing away until I hit the far wall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my radio. I called the harbor master, called the police, told them there was something on Pier 7, something dangerous, something that needed to be investigated immediately. 20 minutes later, 3 officers arrived. We walked back to the pier together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. My fear was slowly being replaced by embarrassment. by the creeping suspicion that I had overreacted, that I had seen a drunk fisherman and let my imagination run wild in the isolation of the night shift. But when we reached Pier 7, when we walked all the way to the end where I had seen him standing, my embarrassment evaporated. Because the dock was covered in water, pools of it, puddles that gleamed in the flashlight beams. And the water was black, not dark blue or gray. Black, like oil, like ink, like something pulled from the deepest part of the ocean where light has never penetrated. One of the officers knelt down and touched it, pulled his hand back immediately with a sharp intake of breath. He said it was freezing cold, colder than ice water, colder than anything that should exist in liquid form. And it had a texture, thick, almost gel-like. When he shined his light through a puddle, the beam did not penetrate. The water was completely opaque. They searched the entire pier, checked the boats, looked in the water with spotlights, found nothing, no one, no explanation for the pools of black water that covered the dock. No explanation for what I had seen. They took my statement, told me to go home, told me they would investigate further in the morning. But I could not go home. Not yet, because I needed answers. I needed to understand what I had witnessed. So I went to the harbormaster's office and started going through old records. Incident reports, accident logs, anything that might explain the eyeless fisherman. And I found something, buried in a file from 1973. A report about a fishing vessel called the Sarah Ann that went down in a storm 12 miles off the coast. 7 crew members lost, bodies never recovered. But what made my blood run cold was the description of the captain. His name was Thomas Merrick, and according to the manifest, he was known for wearing an old-style oilskin coat and rubber boots, the kind that fishermen stopped using decades ago. There was a photograph attached to the report, black and white, faded, showing the crew standing on the dock before their final voyage. And there in the center was Thomas Merrick. Even in the old photograph, even through the grain and age, I recognized him. The same build, the same posture, the same face I had seen on Pier 7. Except in the photograph, he still had eyes. I kept digging, found more reports, incidents stretching back over the years. Security guards who reported seeing a drenched figure on the docks at night. Fishermen who described encountering a man with no eyes standing on their boats when they returned from sea. Every report was dismissed, written off as exhaustion, hallucinations, the isolation and stress of working in one of the most dangerous harbors in America. But they were all describing the same thing, the same figure, the same eyeless face, the same black water pouring from empty sockets. And every report had one thing in common. Every person who saw him disappeared within a month. I found 17 names, 17 people who reported seeing the eyeless fisherman over the past 50 years. And every single one of them vanished. Some while out fishing, some in their homes, some simply walking down the street in broad daylight. Gone. Without a trace, without explanation. I am writing this account 28 days after I saw him. 28 days of looking over my shoulder, of checking locks 3 times before bed, of seeing his eyeless face in every shadow, of waking up to the sound of water dripping somewhere in my house even though I can never find the source. Because I know what is coming. I have known since that night on Pier 7, since he pointed at me, since he marked me. The others did not understand what was happening to them. But I do. I have read the reports, I have seen the pattern, and I know that sometime soon, probably when I least expect it, I will hear wet footsteps behind me. I will smell that deep ocean rot. I will turn around and see him standing there, water pouring from those terrible empty sockets, reaching for me with hands that have been beneath the waves for over 50 years. Last night, I woke up at 3 in the morning. My bedroom was freezing despite the heater running full blast. And there were wet footprints leading from my door to the foot of my bed. Black water. The same impossible black water from Pier 7. They stopped right where someone would stand to look down at me while I slept. I am leaving Dutch Harbor tomorrow. Driving down to Anchorage, maybe catching a flight to Seattle. Somewhere far from the ocean. Somewhere he cannot find me. But deep down, I know it will not matter. Because the others ran too. They all ran, and they all disappeared anyway. The truly horrifying thing is not what I saw that night. It is what I have come to understand about Dutch Harbor. About all harbors. About every place where the ocean touches the land. The water remembers. It remembers every ship that went down. Every sailor who drowned. Every body that sank into the depths. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the darkness is deep enough, the water gives something back. Not alive, not dead, something in between. Something that exists in that terrible space where the living world meets whatever lies beneath the waves. And once it sees you, once it marks you, there is no escape. Because the ocean is patient. The ocean is vast, and the ocean always collects what it is owed. So here's what I need to know, and I need you to be honest in the comments. Have you ever been near water? Any water? The ocean? A lake? Even a pool? And felt absolutely certain that something beneath the surface was watching you? That something down there knew you were there and was waiting? Write your answer below, because I think I know now what is watching. And I think it is watching all of us. Story 9. Demon that walks on the sea ice. The thing I am about to tell you will change how you understand danger. It will change how you look at the Arctic. And if you unlucky, it will change your entire understanding of what is real and what is hidden just beyond the edge of human perception. My name is Thomas Alulu, and I've been a seal hunter and guide in northern Alaska for 42 years. I've survived things that should have killed me. I've seen the Arctic in ways most people will never witness. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered out on the sea ice 3 winters ago. The locals in our village have always told stories. Stories passed down through generations. Stories about the tall figure. Stories about something that walks on the frozen ocean when most sensible people are huddled inside their homes. We call it the demon. That is not the original name in our language, but it's what the English speakers call it. So that is what I use now. The hunters know these stories. Every experienced seal hunter in northern Alaska knows them. Most dismiss them as folklore, old tales meant to scare children and keep them away from dangerous ice. But the old hunters, the ones who spent 50 years or more on the frozen sea, they know better. They know the stories are warnings. According to the stories, the demon is impossibly tall, 7 feet, maybe 8 feet, though descriptions vary depending on who you ask. It is skeletal, meaning its frame is thin, almost impossibly thin, with long limbs that move in ways that look fundamentally wrong. The stories describe the demon as having skin that is grayish, almost translucent, stretched tight over bone. It walks on the sea ice in the dead of winter, usually in the darkness of the Arctic night. And here is the terrifying part that everyone agrees on. The demon appears right before the worst blizzards strike. The most deadly storms, the ones that kill hunters who venture out, the ones that trap entire communities in whiteout conditions where visibility is zero and the wind is strong enough to blow a grown man across the ice. I heard these stories my entire life. I've been mocked by younger hunters for even acknowledging them. Superstition, they say. Old people, it's fear of the dark. But I also noticed something that the stories didn't mention. The hunters who claimed to see the demon, the ones who lived to tell about it, they always survived their next hunt. Whatever storm came after, they made it back. The ones who didn't, they report seeing it. Who didn't, to take the warning seriously, sometimes they didn't come back at all. 3 years ago, in late February, I was out on the ice about 12 miles from shore. The weather was perfect, cold. Yes, but the kind of cold that is manageable if you were prepared. The sky was clear, the ice was solid. I was hunting seals, and the conditions were ideal. I'd been out since dawn, and it was now about 3 in the afternoon, the kind of afternoon in Arctic winter where the light is dim and gray even at midday. I was moving across the ice toward a breathing hole I marked the day before when I noticed something wrong with the horizon. The ice ahead of me looked different. Not dangerous different, just different. The surface had a faint shimmer to it, like heat waves rising from concrete on a hot summer day. Except this was the middle of an Arctic winter. I remember thinking it was strange. I remember my instincts telling me something was off. I slowed my pace, studying the ice carefully. That is when I heard the sound. It was a kind of scraping noise, like something metallic being dragged across ice. Except there was nothing metallic anywhere near me. Just me, my rifle, my hunting pack, and the frozen ocean stretching out in every direction. The scraping sound was coming from somewhere ahead of me, somewhere beyond my visual range. It was rhythmic, methodical. Whatever was making that sound was moving with purpose. I stood completely still. Survival in the Arctic depends on careful decision-making. You don't run toward unexplained sounds, and you don't run away from them blindly either. You stop and think and listen. I listened for what felt like minutes, trying to place where exactly that sound was coming from. The Arctic has a way of playing tricks with sound. Noises can seem closer or farther than they actually are. Echoes bounce off ice in unexpected ways. Then the scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, that feels like something is holding its breath. I was holding my breath too. The wind had died down. The usual constant whisper of the Arctic wind across the ice had completely stopped. Even the ice beneath my feet seemed to be quiet, like the entire world was waiting for something. That is when I saw it. It appeared at the edge of my vision first. Something tall moving across the ice in the distance. At first, I thought it was another hunter. We occasionally crossed paths out on the ice, and it wasn't unusual to see other people in the distance during hunting season. But as my eyes focused on the figure, I realized something was terribly wrong. The shape was too tall. The movement was too fluid and strange. The figure was walking across the ice in a way that no human walks. It was moving with a kind of gliding motion, like its legs were too long and it was taking enormous strides that covered impossible distances with each step. The figure was silhouetted against the gray twilight of the Arctic afternoon, and I could see that the body was skeletal. The proportions were absolutely wrong. Long, thin arms hung down past where knees should be. The head was small compared to the elongated body. The whole thing looked like a stick figure drawn by someone who didn't understand human anatomy. I immediately recognized it from the stories. This was the demon. My first instinct was to run. Pure survival instinct took over, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn away from this impossible thing and move as fast as I could toward the shore. But something stopped me, some deeper understanding that running wouldn't help. That whatever this thing was, it was faster than I was, and it would catch me if I tried to flee. So instead, I stood frozen, watching the demon move across the ice in that terrible, wrong way. It was moving perpendicular to my position, moving parallel to the shoreline rather than toward me or away from me. As I watched, it covered what should have been a 2-minute walk in about 15 seconds. The speed was horrifying. The movement was smooth and predatory and completely alien. The thing didn't run like an animal or walk like a human. It did both and neither simultaneously, moving with an efficiency that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The demon was maybe half a mile away now. I could see it more clearly as it got closer to my position, though it still wasn't moving toward me directly. It was moving laterally across my view, and I could now see that the surface of its skin had a faint luminescence to it, like it was glowing slightly in the dim Arctic light. The glow was sickly, a kind of pale blue-green, and it illuminated the ice immediately around the creature as it moved. Then it stopped. The demon froze mid-stride, which looked grotesque given its body structure. One impossibly long leg was extended, the other bent, and its entire skeletal body went rigid. For several seconds, nothing moved. I couldn't even see it breathing, if it breathed at all. The thing was just standing on the ice, completely motionless, and I became absolutely certain that it was looking at me. I couldn't see eyes. I couldn't see a face clearly enough to identify facial features. But I felt that thing, its attention focused directly on me across the half-mile of frozen ocean that separated us. Terror flooded through my entire body. My hands started shaking. My chest felt tight like someone was squeezing my lungs. Every bit of instinct and experience I built up over 42 years of Arctic hunting told me to move. The fear was almost paralyzing. I had to force myself to think, to override the panic that was threatening to shut down my rational mind. I made a decision. I turned around slowly, deliberately, trying not to move in a way that looked like panicked fleeing. I started walking back toward the shore at a steady pace. My legs felt like they were made of concrete. Every step felt impossibly slow. I was acutely aware that behind me, somewhere out on the ice, the demon was still watching. Still waiting. I didn't look back. That was the hardest part. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and see where the thing was, what it was doing, if it was moving toward me. But I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, to keep moving at a steady pace, to give no indication that I was terrified beyond measure. About 2 minutes into my retreat, I heard the scraping sound again. That horrible metallic dragging sound I heard before. It was behind me now, moving, following. I wanted to run. I wanted to sprint across the ice as fast as my legs could carry me. Instead, I forced myself to maintain my pace. Walk, done, to run, done, to show fear, done, to show prey behavior. The scraping sound got louder. The demon was getting closer. I could hear it now, a rhythmic sound like fingernails dragging across frozen concrete, over and over and over. Each time I heard it, I knew it meant the thing was moving, was covering ground, was getting nearer. I was maybe 3 miles from shore now, 3 miles of ice between me and solid ground and safety. I started walking faster, not running, but moving with more urgency. The scraping sound accelerated too. The demon was matching my pace, keeping constant distance between us. We were moving together across the ice, predator and prey, separated by maybe a quarter mile. I could feel the presence behind me, not just hear it, feel it, a kind of pressure on the back of my head, like intense attention focused at laser precision on my body. And then the wind picked up. The Arctic wind suddenly came roaring back, and the temperature dropped so fast I could feel it like a physical thing. Within seconds, the light started changing. The gray afternoon was getting darker. The clouds were rolling in, and the visibility was dropping. I looked up and saw clouds moving across the sky in ways that didn't match normal weather patterns. They were moving too fast, swirling, organizing themselves into patterns that looked almost intentional. A blizzard was coming, not a normal storm, but the kind of emergency blizzard that kills. The kind that comes out of nowhere and transforms the Arctic into a killing field. The kind that the story said always came after the demon appeared. I did run now. I couldn't help it. The fear of being caught out on the ice in zero visibility drove me to sprint. My lungs burned. My legs pumped. The ice beneath my feet became treacherous as the first snow started falling. The wind picked up to a roar. The visibility was dropping by the second. I could barely see 5 feet ahead of me. I was running blind toward what I hoped was the direction of shore when I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The pale, luminescent glow of the demon was ahead of me now, not behind me. It was moving across my path perpendicular to my direction. It was intercepting me. The thing was impossibly fast, impossibly efficient at movement. It had somehow gotten ahead of me while I was running at top speed. The glow grew brighter as the storm grew darker. I could see the skeletal outline of the creature more clearly now. The elongated limbs, the small head, the wrongness of its entire structure. It turned toward me. I know it turned toward me because I felt the pressure of its attention shift directly onto my body. I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped running directly at the creature and cut hard to my left, angling away from its position. The ground was getting more difficult to navigate as the blizzard intensified. I was running partially blind, feeling my way across the ice, and I had absolutely no idea if I was getting closer to shore or moving parallel to the coastline or even moving back out into deeper ice. Behind me and around me, I could hear the scraping sound. Multiple times now, like the demon was moving in multiple directions at once, or like there were multiple demons. The sound was everywhere and nowhere. The wind was howling so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. And then I felt my foot touch solid ground. I did reach the shore. I didn't remember exactly how I got there, but suddenly I was stumbling off the ice and onto the beach, my legs giving out as soon as they hit land. I collapsed onto the frozen sand and forced myself to turn around and look back at the ice I had just escaped. The blizzard was in full force now. Whiteout conditions. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. But there, at the edge of the ice where it met the beach, I could still see that pale luminescent glow. The demon was standing at the boundary between sea ice and land. It wasn't moving now. It was just standing there, skeletal and terrible and wrong, watching me from across that small distance. The creature seemed to understand something about the boundary, about where it could go and where it couldn't. After a moment that felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the glow moved. The demon turned away from me and walked back out onto the ice, moving into the full force of the blizzard until it disappeared entirely into the white. The moment it left the visible range, the pressure that had been crushing my chest eased slightly. I spent that night huddled in an emergency shelter I prepared on the beach, riding out the storm. It raged for 16 hours. When it finally cleared, the wind stopped as suddenly as it had started. The weather returned to normal Arctic winter conditions within minutes. It was like the blizzard had never existed, except for the snow covering everything and my absolute knowledge of what had happened. I made my way back to the village the next morning. The other hunters had stayed home during the storm, sensing the danger as if by collective instinct. They knew about the demon. They knew that seeing it meant something terrifying was coming. When I told them what I experienced, they didn't question me. They didn't doubt me. They simply nodded with the grim understanding of people who knew the old stories were true. What I understand now, after 3 years of living with this knowledge, is that the demon is sent to hunting hunters to kill them. At least, that it's not its primary purpose. The demon appears to warn. It appears to test. It appears to see who is paying attention, who is connected to the old knowledge, who understands that the Arctic is not just a place but a presence, The hunters who see it and survive are the ones who understand that warning. The hunters who don't see it, or who see it and don't understand its significance, are the ones who sometimes get caught in the blizzards that follow. But there is something else, something more disturbing that I've only recently come to understand. I've been researching old records, talking to the oldest hunters in our community, looking at historical weather data, and I found a pattern that is impossible to explain away as coincidence. Every time the demon appears, someone dies in the resulting blizzard. Not every time, but most times. A hunter goes out and doesn't come back. A traveler gets caught in conditions they couldn't have predicted. Someone is always taken, and I am beginning to suspect that the demon ISN is warning us about the danger. It is causing the danger. It is creating the blizzards. It is using the storms to harvest. I've also noticed something deeply unsettling about myself since that encounter. I've been having dreams, terrible dreams where I'm out on the ice, but I am tall. I am impossibly tall. My limbs are long and thin and wrong. My skin is pale and luminescent, and I'm walking across the frozen sea, searching for something. Someone. In the dreams, I can feel purpose behind my movements. I am not hunting animals. I am hunting people. I am telling you this because I need to know if anyone else has had these dreams. I need to know if seeing the demon does something to you, something that changes you on a fundamental level. The dreams are getting more frequent. They're getting more vivid. And sometimes when I wake up, I find my hands are cold. Terribly, impossibly cold, cold that doesn't match the heated indoor temperature. Cold that feels like I've been standing outside in Arctic winter for hours. Last week, I was driving on a highway in the lower 48, miles and miles away from Alaska, from the ice, from anything Arctic. And I saw it, in my peripheral vision, reflected in a storefront window. I saw that pale luminescent glow. I saw the skeletal outline of something impossibly tall. And when I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. Just a reflection of myself in the glass. But my reflection looked wrong. My reflection looked too tall, too thin, wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I think the demon ISM is just something that walks on the sea ice. I think it is something that can exist in other places too. I think seeing it changes you. And I think I might be changing. I think something inside me might be becoming like it. So here is my question for everyone listening. And I am asking it with genuine fear in my heart. Have you ever seen something that wasn't supposed to exist? Have you ever looked in a mirror or a reflection and seen something staring back that didn't quite look like you? Have you ever had dreams about being somewhere cold and tall and moving in ways your waking body couldn't move? Tell me in the comments below. Tell me I am not alone in this. Tell me that what happened to me on that ice isn't happening to others. Because if it is, if the demon is spreading somehow, if seeing it is changing people across the continent, then we need to warn everyone. We need to tell everyone to pay attention to their reflections. We need to tell everyone to remember who they are before it's too late to remember.